welcome to Making Media. My name is Mark Deuze. I'm a professor at the University of Amsterdam, and I'll be your host for this particular session. We're going to be talking about the political economy of the media industry, about this particular approach and what it helps us to understand what media industries are, how they work, how they make it work, and how people who work in the media make the decisions that they do. We'll be talking a little bit about media policy, media concentration and deconcentration, and media management as well, specifically in terms of how every element of the value chain of the media industry functions. If you have questions or comments, please shoot me an email, or better yet, tweet them using hashtag #MakingMedia or at me on Twitter, and I look forward to a discussion. So what we're going to talk about today is trying to get a good answer to these questions. What are the media industries? How are they structured? How do they make money? How do they make it work? How are they managed? And how do people in the media make the decisions that they do? And this, in essence, already tells you something about what the political economy of media is. It is a way of looking at the industry as a whole, to look across the media industries, to consider every aspect of the value chain, of the product cycle in the media industries as a whole, as part of a whole. Additionally, in political economy approaches, we look at the question of power, who has it and who definitely does not have it, as governed by something as fairly fundamental as who pays the bills. In other words, we follow the money, and using that to answer questions about power or lack thereof. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing in this clip, in the story today. So first of all, what are media industries? Well, perhaps it's good to start with the fundamental notion that media industries are part of a broader economic sector, the cultural and creative industries. The cultural and creative industries is extremely diverse. It includes games and music and news and journalism and film and television, but it also includes things like crafts and architecture and software and design. And there are real differences between the media as an industry as well as cultural and creative industries as specific industries. And those differences make a difference, if you will. The key differences are these. You could argue that these 5 elements together form somewhat of a boundary around what makes a media company a media company. First of all, media companies generally produce a wide variety of products. The value of these products, however, is almost extremely unpredictable. Nobody knows if they will work, if people will want them, if people will go out and buy them. The work in media industries has an artisanal character with focus on creativity and craft and skill, but takes place in a distinctly industrial context aimed at the mass market and mass audience and reaching as many people as possible. The production is generally based on either editorial or flow processes of work, which means an editorial process of work is that you invest all your time and money in making this one thing, let's say a movie or a game. And then when that's done, and maybe you have a contract, you'll go and do the next one. In a flow type of production, you are producing something continuously. Let's say a 24-hour television station like CNN or a streaming radio channel. So a constant flow of productions and productivity. And today's media often produce a kind of a blend between this through something called franchising. Think of Pokemon or the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where every product is part of a larger whole. So there's both editorial processes at work as well as flow. But together with a rather modest internationalization, this makes up the media industry. Now, this all may seem rather abstract. So I want to use a quick case to illustrate this point, these characteristics. So just to get our definition straight, if you will. The case that I'm using is a originally Dutch a streaming alternative radio station called Kink. Happened to be a station when it used to be a traditional radio station I listened a lot to, and then it went bankrupt for a while, and then it was restarted recently as a streaming media company. Now, what makes Kink a media company using these 5 characteristics? Now, first of all, Kink has a remarkable diversity of products. It makes radio, it produces podcasts, it is an advertising network, it does branded content where outside sponsors pay them to produce content specifically. It juggles multiple income and revenue streams, hosts reads advertisements on air, but it also has volunteers producing content, and traditional radio spots that are being made. So there's a lot of different types of activities going on that all contribute to the product cycle at Kink. Secondly, whether all of this will work is entirely unpredictable. To launch a new radio channel, a streaming radio channel in this day and age is risky. I mean, and are people really waiting for this? Aren't we all just, logged on to Spotify and compiling our own soundtrack of our life? So there's a high level of nobody knows whether any of this will work. And of course, the cost to get a license to become a radio station are quite high. So a lot of risk is being taken, which risk is then spread by this remarkable diversity, this broad portfolio of products that, to some extent, typifies the contemporary media industry. The working conditions are kind of interesting too at Kink, because you have DJs that are paid, that are professionals, that host shows and podcasts, but you also have volunteers who make content and who host shows, and a lot of people in between, interns, temp workers, administrative staff, IT staff. So there is an artisanal quality to all of this, where people do it for making art for art's sake, doing this because they love radio. And then there's this distinctly industrial context, where some people are not paid or underpaid for their work, and where everything, of course, is ultimately measured by the bottom line, by keeping the station afloat commercially. And finally, we see a relatively modest internationalization at Kink, which means that basically most of the shows are in Dutch, but a lot of the music is in English. Some shows are in English, and of course you can listen to Kink from anywhere in the world because it's a streaming service. And this modest internationalization is perhaps a little bit counterintuitive for a lot of you, in the sense that we sometimes assume that the media industries are much more homogeneous than they really are. We think this is a question of Americanization, right? That American commercials and American movies and so on, an American aesthetic has come to dominate the world, but that's not really the case if we look what actually is going on. We see that most media markets are distinctly local, and that tastes and taste cultures and market success is often based on particular variables that are particular to a specific group or community or place, rather than universal values. Well, not everybody likes the same things. Only rarely they do. So that together makes media industries. And I guess I would have to add to this an important caveat, which is that what makes the media industry an industry is copyright, in the sense that without very strict copyright legislation, this industry would not be able to charge us money for the right to access its products and services. So whereas the entire industry tends to lobby for market deregulation, right, for less policy intervention, for more freedoms and less restrictions, the exception the entire industry makes is regarding copyrights. So copyrights undergirds the economic power and position of media as an industry around the world. So how are these industry structures? Now, generally, when we think of the structure of the media industry, we often think of companies and corporations that look a bit like this, like the massive buildings. I mean, here you see the headquarters of the New York Times and Time Warner in downtown New York. Intimidating buildings that are filled with people who determine what's going to happen next, what movies we see, what news we read. And this is a tempting way to think of media industries. And when we look at at who owns the media, not just in the United States or in Western Europe, but around the world, we would have to conclude that, yeah, these buildings are a good metaphor for the entire media industry, right? Because the media industry is generally divided among just a handful of mega corporations, of international, multinational enterprises that span the globe, that have tens of thousands of employees in many, many different countries. And for many commentators and researchers and pundits and policymakers as well, this is a highly problematic idea. The notion that so few companies control so much of our media, and they equate media ownership consolidation with the illusion of choice. The fact that we may have 300 television channels and we may have the choice of 20 movies being released every week and thousands of books being published every month and all that. But really, when you trace back the money, when you follow the money, only 4 or 5 or maybe 6 companies really control all of that. So do we then still have choice? This is an important critical perspective, often equated with what is called the critical political economy of media point of view. But there is some nuance to this. One comes from an influential study that was carried out by economists at Harvard University some time ago, where they looked at, well, you know what? Let's look at how much money these big media companies have made. Media companies that are often run by rather unique individuals, moguls they're called, the Rupert Murdochs of this world. How do they make money? And they came to the rather interesting conclusion that they didn't. In fact, collectively, the big media corporations over the last 20, 30 years or so lost over 200 billion in shareholders' value. Oops. So, how are they still so big? Well, partly is because the valuation of media companies tends not necessarily to be based on how much money they earn or lose. It tends to be based on reputation, on whether they're seen as being dynamic and innovative and producing things that everybody's talking about, a new spectacle or spectacular movie, securing the broadcasting rights for a high-profile sporting event like the Olympic Games or something like that. But in reality, a lot of these companies, most of these companies are actually hemorrhaging their shareholders' value. And this is, according to these economists, based on 4 myths, 4 mistakes that big media corporations continue to make. I'll briefly review these 4 mistakes. And the reason for that is that they show you that to simply assume that a big media corporation is all powerful is exactly that. Too simple. It's a bit more complicated, like everything. So the first myth of these companies is that they always assume that growth is good. More is better. So what they are primarily invested in is in something called M&A, mergers and acquisitions. These companies gobble up other companies like it's breakfast cereal. They are constantly buying, also selling, but mostly buying other companies under the assumption is that bigger is better. And the problem is it generally isn't. It makes companies less flexible, more unwieldy, harder to invest in innovation when you're constantly juggling all these new cultures, these new technologies, and the new ways of doing things. Secondly, they assume that going global is better. And that seems fairly obvious, right? If you can sell your product not just in the Netherlands, but, around the world, not just in Taiwan or Australia or Buenos Aires, but everywhere, that's better, right? No, it's not. Why? Like I mentioned before, media cultures are local cultures. The internet isn't a global medium, it's a local medium. We tend to hang out with, access content that is near to us rather than everywhere to us. So this is a typical mistake that big corporations keep making. A third mistake is that they assume that the more content you have, the better. Right? That ultimately what drives us to the media is to consume content. Now, look at the way you yourself spend time with media. What do you mostly spend time with? Consuming content or making it? And making content in media is every text we send, every status update, every comment, every like, every click on our keyboards is us producing some kind of content. Sometimes that content is just data. So content isn't fundamentally what drives us to media. It's connection with others. So there's another myth that explains to some extent why big media corporations aren't that powerful after all. And finally, they've consistently embraced the cult of convergence. The idea that if you combine lots of different types of media, games, film, movie theaters, printing presses, studios, if you have all of that, and then all these people will then, become friends and work together and high five in the hallways and sing Kumbaya, and they will be awesome and great. That will bring in the big bucks. No, it doesn't. As some people who are studying media management sometimes say, managing media workers is like herding cats. They don't necessarily like working together all that much. They're idiosyncratic, or they think of themselves they are. So it makes them hard to manage. It makes them hard to provide synergies that cut across different companies, different ways of doing things, different ways of using technology, different ways of reaching and forming relationships with audiences. So convergence isn't necessarily a good thing for these big corporations. So that to some extent dispels this myth of corporations running it all. So the structure of the global media industry has basically two sides. You could argue two parts of an hourglass, and the hourglass represents the number of people working somewhere. On one part, let's say the top part, not necessarily the most powerful part, at least not all the time, of the hourglass consists of generally only a handful of big companies or corporations that are mostly in the business of securing copyrights, distributing and marketing products. And on the other side of the hourglass are thousands upon thousands of tiny little companies, often with not more than 4 or 5 employees, that actually produce the content. And the arrows that you see in the model here represent dynamism, in the sense that I told you earlier, one of the myths governing media corporations that growth is good. So they're often in the business of buying smaller companies at the bottom end of the hourglass, including them into their workflow, securing the rights to often temporarily distribute their products, and then selling them off again. That's the whole principle behind mergers and acquisitions. Now, how does that look like? For example, in advertising, the global industry looks a bit like this, with a handful of big holding firms on one end, Publicis, originally from France, Dentsu, originally from Japan, Omnicom, which is originally an American company, WPP, which is originally British. And these are holding firms that together represent hundreds, if not thousands, of advertising agencies and marketing companies and bureaus around the world. And then on the other side, you have these thousands upon thousands of generally smaller, often independent or indie agencies that work with specific clients or do specific projects. In the games industry, we see the same structure. A handful of big companies, Electronic Arts from the US, Bandai Namco and Square Enix and Capcom from East Asia, Activision Blizzard, which is a combined French-Canadian company, Japanese American company, and Ubisoft, a French-Canadian company. And then on the other hand, you have these thousands upon thousands smaller game studios that actually make the games, that then often get distributed by the big corporations, the publishers on the other side of the hourglass. Music, same story. A few big mega labels that often are in the business of buying up, picking up, and then further promoting and distributing the work of smaller record labels or indies on the other side of the hourglass. So we see the same structure over and over in all these different media industries, representing the way employment is structured. What this all leads to is what some people call a new international division of cultural labor. What that means is that work in the media industry is consistently global, which means that more and more work for films or games is distributed all over the world. Where, for example, for a game, part of the game is made in the US, part of it is made in Japan, and some of it is programmed in Ireland. And then one company brings all these different elements together and then distributes it in one way or another. That also means that if you're a game professional working in Ireland, that yes, sometimes you get to work on a really amazing game that has global impact. But if the distributor or the sponsor or the publisher decides to shift programming of that game not to Ireland, but let's say to Belgium or to South Africa, then you're out of a job. Unless you move to Belgium or South Africa, which almost nobody does. So this also means that the production of media is a global phenomenon, whereas the work in media is a local one. That's why we talk about Hollywood as the American movie industry. That's why we talk about Silicon Valley as the American tech industry. They're not all over the US. No, they're all located in one specific place. And Madison Avenue as the American advertising industry. Now, I'm giving you examples from the US, but if you look at your own country, you have the same structure. In the Netherlands, in my home country, we have the Media Park, which is where pretty much all the broadcasters are co-located in one specific park. And this is how media industries tend to be structured, suggesting that the work is local. That's why they're all close together. They're also close to each other's employees. But the production takes place on a global scale. It's interconnected. Now, how do they make money? How do these companies make money? Well, the thing is, what you need to know about this is basically three things. The first is that, it used to be so simple. Media companies made money based on one of three ways. Subscriptions, like subscribing to a newspaper or something like that. Sales, a movie ticket, or you buy a disc of a video game in a store. Or advertising. You could get the product for free, but you paid for it by looking at ads. Now, the general consensus is that those models don't really work anymore. People don't subscribe to anything anymore unless it's to a streaming service, and those are not media companies. Although that's beginning to change. Netflix used to be only into the streaming business, but now has its own studios all over the world producing its own content. So that's an interesting development. A brand new one too. People don't really pay much for individual products anymore. We don't buy discs. We don't buy movie tickets. Yes, I'm not saying people not going to the movies anymore, but their numbers are dwindling. And advertising, 80% of advertising worldwide has pretty much shifted to platforms, right? To the Googles and Facebooks and Tencents and Alibabas and those kind of companies. And those are not media companies. So the media industry has lost an enormous chunk of its revenue, its traditional revenue from advertising, subscriptions, and sales in the last 2 decades. So what has come in place are two things. First is an enormous variety of business models. There are so many different ways to make money as a media company, and what will work today won't work tomorrow. So you see media companies scrambling to develop sort of a flexible approach to securing revenue. This is an incredibly complicated task, making the life not exactly easier from a commercial perspective. It is also incredibly creative. There's so many opportunities. It isn't as simple as just, build it and they will come and people will pay. No, you have to come up with all kinds of creative strategies. So that is an interesting field in and of itself, both to work in and to study. The second way in which the media companies today are increasingly investing to make money is through something called engagement. Engagement is pretty much the holy grail of the media industry today. And engagement, what that means is that traditionally engagement was something that happened after the product cycle of the media industry was done. In other words, content was created, and it was then put out there, and then people purchased it or watched it or listened to it, and that was it. That was done. Work is done. On to the next. Today, engagement has become part of the value proposition of the media industry. What that means is that simply having a product and selling it or distributing it in one way or another isn't good enough anymore. People need to be doing stuff with it. And that could mean after the fact, for example, by tweeting about it and having conversations about it on Instagram, or making little parody films about it on TikTok or something like that. Or it even means in earlier phases of the production process, getting the consumer involved to co-create, to brainstorm, to provide feedback, to spread the word. Engagement is key. We are not considered to be passive consumers anymore, and we could argue we never really were. It's just now with contemporary media technologies, we can talk back. There's one way of answering the question how media companies make money is by answering the question, how do they earn money, right? And that's what I've been talking about until now, right? The question about advertising, subscription, and sales, about the flexibilization of business models, and about the holy grail of engagement. The second way to talk about how media companies make money is how they spend money. And media companies tend to be pretty smart about this. And that smartness is not entirely unproblematic. First of all, they spread costs, right? It's common wisdom in the media industry that you shouldn't bank all your money on one horse. Any production studio won't, if it's smart, won't spend all of its money into producing this one big epic film and then praying that it will work. No, they will produce 10 films a year, assuming from the get-go that only one or two will actually, bring home the euros, the dollars, the yens. And that will hopefully then pay for the production costs of everything else. So that's spreading the costs. The reason why there's so much product diversification in the media industry is because that spreads the cost, spreads the risk, and gives you a chance to survive if something doesn't stick, doesn't work. Second, they engage in some kind of price fixing. It tends to be a kind of price fixing that isn't entirely illegal, but borderline. The notion of what determines the price of a DVD or Blu-ray, what determines the price of a video game that you buy in a store, what determines the cost of a newspaper or magazine that you buy in a kiosk. Well, are those prices truly a reflection of what it took to make them? No. They are often an attempt of the industry to coordinate these kind of prices, to prevent anybody from asking too much or too little. It's a careful, nuanced calibration that may or may not have anything to do with what it costs to make them. An example in case would be an Xbox or a PlayStation. If you buy a box like that, Microsoft and Sony lose money. However, they know that once you have that box, you're more likely than others to then subscribe to their services, like get a Game Pass, for example, for the Xbox, and of course to buy individual games. And every time you do that, they earn a lot of money for basically providing the box. So that's an interesting example of price fixing. So, thirdly, media companies spend their money by not paying wages, or at least not paying decent wages. And most people in the media industry are underpaid, and a lot of them are even not paid at all. Interns, of course, are often not paid. But so many people work in the industry doing what is called speculative work. Work that you do now in the hope to get paid for it later. What do you think of script writers for television shows and movies? They get paid if their show actually goes in production. Until that time, you're on your own. So there's that notion of not paying wages that makes it easier for media companies to survive. And finally, media companies outsource risk. More and more media companies are increasingly trimming their staff, becoming smaller and smaller in terms of the number of people they employ. And every time they get a production going, whether that's a film or a documentary or a game or some kind of special, news special or whatever it is that they're making, they then hire people onto that project. And this flexibilization of the work, this sort of project-based labor, is a way of outsourcing the risk. Financial risk of keeping the company afloat. So how do media make it work? Well, generally in one of two ways. The first way is what is called in economic terms the Pareto Principle. Rule of thumb is the 80-20 rule. And what that means is that you assume that, generally speaking, 20% of what you do earns enough to pay for the cost of the other 80%. So, for example, in the movie industry, let's say a studio makes about 10 movies a year, like I said earlier. If one of them is Titanic, that will end up paying the bills for all the other ones. And often that's how investment strategies work. And you sometimes maybe you have the experience, you're watching a movie in the theater or on television, like how did anybody greenlight this shit, right? Like, how did anybody decide to spend 10, 50, $100 million on this? Well, because the strategy for that business was we have this budget for a year, let's say it's $1 billion. We'll produce 25 movies. Some of them will get a bit bigger budget in the hopes that one or two of them will stick. One or two of them will rake it in, will make it big. And that will pay off the fact that the rest will stink, will lose, will hemorrhage money. So the losses on products and media are built in, are planned. This is not a shock to the system if a movie or a new album by a new artist or a TV show tanks. This is calculated in advance. Even in journalism, we see this. Like when you see the front page of a newspaper, like in this case, the British Daily Telegraph, journalists would like to tell you that the most important news is on page 1 and 3, which may be so, but this is also an economic argument. Right, a newspaper is there to get your attention, so they put the stories on the front page that will most likely interest most people and seduce them to buy the paper or get a subscription or something like that. So it's the same ideas that, and does that mean that people will then actually read the rest of the newspaper? No, most people don't. But that 20% of print real estate, page 1 and 3. Ends up paying the bills for the production cost of the rest. That model is, in the digital age, offset by a model that is sometimes called the long tail. There is some debate whether this model really, really works, and maybe it only works for a handful of companies, like Netflix. But it is an interesting proposition, and you do see a lot of media companies following this model. The model basically says, okay, there's no guaranteed mass audience anymore. And unlike the 60s where everybody watched one television show, we now watch, you take 3 sets of neighbors, what did you watch last night? And you get 3 different types of shows. So there's no guaranteed mass audience anymore, except perhaps for certain sporting events or something like that. The final of the World Cup's football or something like that. But that's pretty much it. So another way of thinking is, well, in a digital age, if you can't get a mass audience, you can aggregate a small audience. And what that means is if you produce, instead of 10 movies and hoping that one will stick, you produce 500 movies that each will have a tiny little audience. But together, in aggregate, they're a big audience, they're a mass audience. And that will end up paying the bills. This is the Netflix model. If you ever wonder, how does Netflix do this? They release new shows like every day, movies constantly. I mean, the cost involved is enormous, and this is true. But their strategy is built on something very simple. It's like, well, yeah, no, not all of them will work, but all those micro audiences together will produce a mass audience that in turn produces income in two ways. One is subscription payments, and two is data that will strengthen the algorithm that is used to produce new stuff and new insights on what they should be making. So the long tail versus the Pareto Principle, in a nutshell, are the two fundamental ways in which media industries make money. How are media industries managed? Right? Given what we know now about what the key elements are of what makes a media industry, how are they structured and how do they make money? How are they then managed? And what you need to know about media management comes down to two specific perspectives. The first one is how incredibly more rich, diverse, and complicated managing a media company has become. And secondly, the delicate dance, the incredibly delicate balancing act that every single media company, whether it's in journalism, film, music, television, games, whatnot, is involved in, between keep doing what it does well and coming up with new things. So first of all, a model that you've also seen in the book Making Media, on which this talk is based, part of the book, of course, which is this model that indicates the shift from traditional media management that was focused on creating specific products for specific media with limited use of technology intended for single use. There's a movie that was just distributed to theaters, for example, and fairly straightforward, to a contemporary environment where media management is all about managing massive portfolios of richly diverse products that all tie into each other. So I remember a conversation once with the producer of the original Big Brother television show, which is a global franchise which started in the Netherlands in 1999, 2000. About around the same time as Survivor started in Sweden. Survivor was first, if I'm not mistaken. And he said, look, I mean, in this day and age, you can't pitch a television show anymore to an executive. You have to pitch a multimedia strategy, right? What are we going to do with television? What are we going to do online? What are we going to do with mobile? What are we going to do? And so on and so forth. And that's what the format of Big Brother was originally intended as a multimedia production. And this is increasingly the case with all media, that media are not produced as a single-use, one-off product for a specific medium, but as part of a larger portfolio of multimedia products and productivity, which is incredibly interesting and creatively exciting, but also much more complicated. And I personally, I always I'm amazed with how companies keep pulling this off, this sort of rich, textured, multimedial sort of environment that we all live in today and that we all enjoy so much. And the second element of media management has to do with this, like I said, a delicate dance, a balancing act between exploiting what you've done before and exploring what you could do next. The balance between exploitative and explorative innovation. So let's say you are a news organization and you have a specific way of doing things, putting most important news first. You have a certain type of a color, a style, a tone of voice, and a lot of people tune into your shows or buy or subscribe to your paper or whatever product you put out there. Now, that suggests that, hey, you're pretty successful. Let's just keep doing what we've always been doing. Let's just stick to the same values. Let's just stick to the same stories, the same narrative structures. Let's just do what we do best. Seems like a sound strategy. Well, the problem is that doesn't really work. If you just keep producing what you've always been producing, people just stop paying attention. It's just not interested. There's so much other stuff out there. So you can't just keep doing what you've always been doing. You also have to come up with new shit. Be original. Twist things a bit. A new design, a new font, new types of stories, new column writers, a new profile, a new whatever, a new app, a new television show, a new podcast. However, if you just do new stuff all the time, people won't know who you are, they won't identify with your brand, or they don't get it. And they also stop paying attention to you. So it can't be either or. You have to do both in a constantly, precarious balancing act. So that makes media management so interesting and also fragile. Let's be honest. So finally, in conclusion, after knowing what media industries are, knowing how they're structured, remember the hourglass, know how they make money, both how they earn a living and how they spend money or not spend money, especially on wages. Know how they generally make it work. And understanding a bit of the intricacies of managing the contemporary media firm. How are decisions actually made? When you walk in the door of a company, of a game studio, of an advertising agency, of a newsroom, how are decisions made? Now, media professionals themselves love to think that decisions are made based on instinct, on gut feeling, on talent, on genius, on what feels right now, on making art for art's sake, on doing what's right. Those are all lovely ideas. But that's not what's really going on. It's a bit of a romantic view on the media industry. And by all means, we should acknowledge and embrace that because it motivates the vast majority of people who go into this industry or want to go into this industry. So give that romantic feeling a hug, and then let's look at this as scholars, as scientists. And then we see a couple of fairly distinct logics governing every single decision that is made in the industry. Often not consciously so, as in, today I will use this logic to make a decision, but much more in a patterned way that is often invisible to professionals themselves, because they're caught in the middle of trying to make something awesome, and a kick-ass game, an amazing campaign, a hard-hitting story. So let's look at the different logics that govern media decision. The first one is also the most popular one among professionals themselves, which is what we call an editorial logic. And an editorial logic means a logic where decisions are made based on what other people like you, your peers, think is good or cool or important. In other words, your source of reference for making your decisions are your colleagues, both in your own company and in competing companies, and of course, your bosses, your editors, your producers, your directors. And this small community of peers, what scholars call an interpretive community, is your primary source of reference, your fellow editors, if you will. And whether people will like it, whether advertisers will like it, doesn't matter, right? The tagline underneath the logo of the New York Times says, all the news that's fit to print. And who decides what's fit to print? The people working inside that epic-sized building that I showed a picture of earlier in this clip. A second logic is arguably the exact opposite of an editorial logic, which is a market logic. In other words, what sells well is what we will produce. End of story. And the graphic you're seeing on this particular slide is a graphic about the global market for movie tickets. And what we know of this global market, that it's declining everywhere except in Asia, and very specifically in China. Which means that we see more and more movies being made exclusively for, or at least partly intended for, the Chinese market and the Chinese audience, or at the very least the Asian market and the Asian audience. Because that's where people still go to movies, and more so this year than last year, and more so last year than the year before. This explains why more and more movies are co-financed or exclusively financed by Chinese companies like Alibaba or Tencent. This explains why we see Chinese actors and actresses appear in Western movies, sometimes even without a speaking role, simply to appease Chinese censors and, of course, Chinese fans. This is one of the reasons why we see so many superhero movies, because they do exceedingly well on the Chinese market. So there's that particular element of a market logic at work in this case, which to some extent governs all the decisions in the media industry, but not exclusively. We already saw the importance of an editorial logic, but there's also something called data logic. This is a relatively new logic on the field, where we see algorithms such as the Netflix algorithm act in two ways, as demand predictor and content creator. What that means is that data that we gather on the basis of what consumers are doing, now that everybody has moved to digital, every click generates data, which then can be mined for decision-making purposes. And some of these decisions are demand predicting decisions. In other words, Netflix's algorithm is quite sophisticated in being able to predict what people would like to see next. Everything on the screen in your Netflix application is a recommendation. And the House of Cards series was an excellent example of this, right? The Netflix algorithm suggested that a significant chunk of its viewing audience was interested in crime, mystery, and intrigue involving American politics, preferably the White House, with a little bit of sex and a little bit of murder starring Kevin Spacey. Netflix went to Kevin Spacey's own production house, said, can you please develop something, a franchise for us based on these variables? His company, of course, didn't come up with something on its own. It just bought the rights to an existing franchise, in this case, an old British drama, reshot it with Kevin Spacey in the lead, and it became a global hit. So now that would seem that this always works. It doesn't. Most data, demand predictions based on big data don't pan out because, remember, the nobody knows dilemma. Audiences are fickle and ultimately quite unpredictable. Another element of data logic is content creation, and that's happened in the case of House of Cards, where the data can be so specific in what it predicts, it can actually produce content on its own, in the sense of perhaps not shooting the scenes in a movie or not writing the lines in a story, but coming fairly close. And I have to correct myself. Automated content creation is making huge strides throughout the industry. A lot of advertising and marketing copy these days is written by robots. There's quite a lot of journalism, economic journalism, sports journalism, that is written by software. Before I say humans will still be making all the content, I should correct myself immediately. Data logic is on the move, people, and we should keep an eye on it. Another type of logic is convergence logic. It's a logic where the cultures of production and consumption converge. What that means is that some of the decisions media companies make are governed by their collaboration with audiences. And sometimes that means quite literally that audiences are invited to produce some of the content on their own, like in the case of citizen journalism, news organizations calling on audiences to submit their video of a certain event, to share their stories, to share pictures and so on, or to help them to do research on something. Game studios asking gamers to test early versions of the games or to modify existing games and create new levels that add value to the original game. These are all examples of convergence logic. Marketers that ask influencers and people on social media to spread the word about their product or their sponsor or their client. Convergence logic. And a final word on logics has to be platform logic. And this is something you could argue is a sort of a thread running throughout my talk today. I've mentioned platforms at every instance, signaling how incredibly important they have become for media industries to orient themselves towards. Platforms today sit in between everything we want from media and everything that media produce. And in the middle have wrestled themselves the platforms. Again, the Facebook, YouTube, WeChat, Instagrams, TikTok, Kik, Qzones, Sina Weibos, and so on of this world. They arguably are now the most powerful player in the media industry, even though they are not a media industry themselves. And so more and more of the decision making within media companies revolves around the question: how are we gonna get this story, this product, this idea, this game, this film, this clip out to the audience? What are we gonna do with Facebook? How are we gonna motivate or mobilize people on Twitter about this? Platforms are increasingly playing a powerful role in decision-making structure, even though they're not a media company. And that's because they have come in between us and everything media do. So together, these different logics explain the kind of decisions professionals and media companies make. Together, these different logics then explain how media are managed. How media are managed to some extent explains how media make it work. That in turn influences and structures how media make money, how then the media are structured, and subsequently how we actually define media. And then we can turn this entire argument around and work away from the top back to the bottom. And that is a political economy of media, by looking across the entire product cycle, the entire value chain of an industry, and to make explicit what difference it makes, how it functions, how it's structured. And of course, and the second question to that would be how power then flows throughout all these different levels. I hope this has contributed a little bit to your understanding of what media are and how they're structured and how they function. Obviously, this was going across the enormous complexity, diversity, and singularity of all the different media companies and products and ways of doing things that exist out there. But from a general rule of thumb, this is how things work. Again, feel free to reach out to me. It was a pleasure having this one-way chat with you, and see you next time.